Hello and welcome to episode number 1 of the Heart Containers podcast, a daily Nintendo show where Monday through Friday we discuss the latest games, news, releases, events, and other topics that all relate to the world of Nintendo. I'm your host, Rami Fawaz, and if you're listening, well, of course you're listening, but you're listening to the show for Monday, January 28th, where we have a bunch of stuff to talk about. This weekend was very eventful in a way that I did not expect, starting on Friday, where we got heavy hitters all day. Starting off with Metroid Prime 4, a development update on that game that was a real shocker to most people, basically stating that Metroid Prime 4 is going to be delayed for a time being. They're starting the development from scratch, and that they're pulling Retro Studios in to help with that development. So that's one of the topics that we're going to be diving into. And then the other topic is that Nintendo President Shuntaro Furukawa was interviewed again. It seems like he's been having a lot of interviews lately, or at least a lot of quotes are being parsed out of interviews and sent into headlines as of late. But he had another interview again where he talked a lot about the successor of the Switch and a price cut for the Switch and how he does not expect that to be happening in 2019. So we're going to jump into that. But of course, before that point, this is a solo podcast, so I encourage you guys to join into these discussions by reaching out to me and letting me know what you think of any of the topics that we talked about today or any other Nintendo thought that happens to be on your mind. You can do so by emailing the show with the address heartcontainerspodcast@gmail.com, or you can reach out to me personally in my most used social media, which is Twitter, where my handle is @RomeFawaz. That's @ROMEFAWAZ. So, how are you guys doing? Monday, it's been one heck of a weekend. I actually enjoyed my weekend quite a bit, despite that it went by too fast. It was definitely one of those weekends where at the start I was like, hey, I don't have that much planned. I can probably get a lot done. And then before you know it, it's the end of Sunday and you're asking yourself, where did the time go? It did feel like that, but I feel good. And maybe it's just because I'm starting this show today. You are listening to episode 1. Welcome. This is a big moment for me. Hopefully I don't let you down. But another reason why I think I had such a good time this weekend is that I got to play a lot of Nintendo games. Not new ones. I didn't play a lot of Switch, but you know what? We're kind of in a dry spell right now in January. Not to say that there isn't that much to play, but there's a good opportunity right now. If you feel the urge to go back and play old games, which a lot of times I do, you have to wait for the right time periods where there isn't a lot going on, and this just happens to be that time. So I went back and I played a lot of prequels actually because I'm very excited. I'm very hyped up for a lot of the games coming out in 2019, Fire Emblem, Animal Crossing, Luigi's Mansion 3, and so I've been having the itch to go back and play those predecessors. So I actually beat Luigi's Mansion again. That game is a lot of fun. The humor and charm and playing as Luigi in this what's supposed to be a creepy, horrifying setting, right? A haunted mansion just makes me laugh. It's a game that's ridiculous because of the concept, and that's why I enjoy getting into it so much. So I got to go play through that, and then I got to start over Animal Crossing New Leaf because I also am very excited for Animal Crossing 2019. I cannot wait for that game. So I'm playing New Leaf again because the Welcome Amiibo edition, like the DLC that came out from it, I never got back into that game when they added it. So these meow coupons, whatever they are, the campgrounds in that game, I don't know anything about it. So I'm excited to try that for the first time. I restarted my town. I went into it. Unfortunately, I started playing that game really late at night, and I remember too late that, it's time based. So as I was playing, I think it said my initiative was to go talk to all the villagers, and they were all sleeping. So that didn't help me very much. And then I went to go do something productive, but the Nook shop was closed, so I couldn't buy like a fishing rod or anything like that. So I just ended up collecting some apples and then putting that game away. But that gave me time to play the third game that I got to dive into this weekend, which was Fire Emblem Echoes, Fire Emblem Shadows of Valentia. I didn't play that game either. I got my fill with Fire Emblem Fates. I played Birthright, and then I played I think half of Conquest. It's a lot of Fire Emblem. Fire Emblem games are really long, and then when Echoes came out, I didn't have the motivation to play that game. I feel like I got my fill with Fates, and if I was going to jump back into a Fire Emblem game, Revelations, the third Fates game, was still hanging in there, and I could finish Conquest. So I skipped this one, but again, I'm so hyped up for Fire Emblem Three Houses and the games coming out this year that I started playing it. And I mean, I've only gotten a couple hours in, but it's already hooked me. There's something about the world and the characters of Fire Emblem that the moment you start playing, it just absorbs you into that. So that's what I've been up to. Curious to know what you guys are playing. Again, reach out to me whatever way you can. I don't think there are a lot of heavy hitter games out these days. I mean, we just saw the release of New Super Mario Brothers U Deluxe. Man, that's a mouthful. And then also Travis Strikes Again. That's a game that people are talking about. But really, it is a dry period for Nintendo up until February 1st, I believe, which is when Wargroove comes out. Man, Wargroove looks so good. If you don't know anything about Wargroove, go check out that Nintendo Indies highlight video that they showed, or just go straight to Chucklefish's website or YouTube and check out Wargroove, especially if you're at all interested in Advance Wars or Fire Emblem, because that game looks so great. It looks phenomenal. I'm a sucker for pixel art. I know a lot of people out there are kind of tired of pixel art in the indie scene because it's overdone to death, but high-end pixel art, games like Owlboy and Wargroove, where they really go and they push it to the limit and it just looks so colorful and vibrant. Man, they make my eyes water. So I'm very excited for Wargroove. We haven't got an Advanced Wars style game in a long time. And again, Fire Emblem is my jam. And those two franchises heavily inspired Wargroove, apparently, according to the dev. So that's what I've been up to. Those are what I'm excited about. Please let me know what you're into. But let's just get into it. Let's get into the topics, guys. Topic number one, we're going to start with the lead. We're not going to bury it. Topic number one is going to be all about Metroid Prime 4. So, if you don't know what happened, on Friday, Nintendo issued an official statement regarding the current development status of Metroid Prime 4. It took the form of like a 3-minute video, and they shared it across all of their marketing channels. I watched it on YouTube, but they talked about it on Twitter and stuff, and that's significant, and we'll get into that for why that's significant, because I mean it's a development update, but they're sharing it in ways that are kind of unusual for a development update to be shared. If you think about their YouTube, and this is the type of thing that I was thinking about when I looked into this news, they use YouTube as like an advertisement platform. Really, the stuff you see on YouTube are kind of like commercials for games that are coming out. You don't see a lot of, oh, here's our technical, potentially depressing update on a game, and let's talk about it to the masses. So that was a real surprising part to me. So they use their native channels, their marketing platforms that talk to everyone and anyone who's interested in Nintendo, even just slightly, to say that Metroid Prime 4 is going to be scrapped and restarted from the ground up. So the quote from Shinya Takahashi, the senior managing executive officer at Nintendo, that really stood out to me was, quote, "The current development progress has not reached the standard we seek in a sequel to the Metroid Prime series." So whatever it was that they were doing with Metroid Prime 4 was not sufficient. They did not like where it was going. They didn't hit the appropriate milestones. However you want to read into that, Nintendo was not satisfied with the current development of Metroid Prime 4, and so the decision was, in which they talk about in a 3-minute video. I'm not going to go through every single word that he said, so if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to go watch it, because it's not that long, and it'll clue you in on the tone and how they talked about this. But the crux of the story was they're going to restart it. So almost everything that they have from that game is basically going to be thrown away, and they're going to restart the development for Metroid Prime 4, as well as change up how and who is going to be developing that game. They mentioned Retro Studios. It seemed like they were implying that they were going to take Metroid Prime 4 and give it to Retro Studios, although they didn't necessarily confirm that. Now, if you weren't aware, Retro Studios was never confirmed to be working on Metroid Prime 4. In fact, I believe it was almost the exact opposite. When the Metroid Prime 4 trailer / teaser, you can't really call that a trailer, when the teaser was shown off at E3 in 2017, a lot of questions came off immediately afterwards, right? Because anyone would assume that since Retro worked on the first 3 Prime games, that Retro would work on Metroid Prime 4, but I think it was quickly denounced that no, Retro's not working on Prime 4. So this is significant because Retro's getting back their baby in that way. But again, we don't know fully what capacity that means. We're not sure, or it wasn't confirmed if Retro is truly going to have the complete run of the show for Prime 4, or if they're just taking, I don't know, a bigger chunk of that work so that they can make sure that it steers on the right ship. So that was what the video talked about. But before we get into that, there was kind of like a follow-up story that led into later into that night, and that was with Game Informer's senior editor, Imran Khan. Excuse me if I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but he sent out a series of tweets suggesting that when Nintendo was developing Prime 4, it was using a sort of experimental approach to the development where they were sharing a lot of the parts of the creation process around multiple teams, potentially in multiple studios. And the experiment proved fatal. So some teams were progressing really well while others were kind of on fire. That's the way that Khan talked about. He said they were on fire. And that was what put Nintendo in this rough position where they tried something new. They tried something experimental with Metroid Prime 4. It did not work. It clearly didn't work. Some parts were okay. Other parts were really, really terrible. And so it forced them to do something like this, which was to release a video to the world, to all of their gaming community, all the gaming community and all Nintendo fans saying, hey, look, we're sorry, but this is what Prime is. This is what happened with Metroid Prime 4. You're not going to get the game as soon as you probably imagined you would. And we're also bringing in help from Retro. The editor went on to explain that Retro made a pitch for their involvement. So they were motivated to get into the Metroid Prime 4 scene, made a pitch to Nintendo, and Nintendo really liked their demo, and that would explain why they specifically went back to Retro, which, I mean, you might question, well, why wouldn't they just go to Retro? Or, why is that weird in the first place? Well, Retro isn't exactly the same team that they were during the Prime days. There's been a lot of churn really throughout all of Retro's history, but that transition from Prime 3 to the Tropical Freeze era, a lot of the people that worked on the original Prime games are not there anymore. So it makes sense that this newer team, which does include some people, but also a lot of new people, would have to come up with their own idea and also show enthusiasm for Prime because maybe they're not into it. And lastly, I think something that's really interesting, really powerful about what Imran Khan had to say about this Metroid development is that Metroid Prime Trilogy, I think he reconfirmed, I actually think that he reported on this earlier, he reconfirmed that the Metroid Prime Trilogy port, which honestly has really just been a rumor so far. You just kind of hear that, hey, when is this port coming? It should coming. We should be coming. We believe in the port. Well, he's saying that it's actually completed. It's done. It's ready to ship for the Switch, and it was supposed to be announced last month in December, but was held off for some unknown reason. And I guess now you would infer that the reason being this announcement. So there's a lot to chew on with this first topic. I tried to go through what happened earlier in the day and then later in the day, but the point of all of this is that Nintendo came out in a very public way. They came out to all of their fans and they basically apologized in a refreshing sense of honesty. Like, they were very transparent with their community, and I've seen a lot of people respond to that and say, we love this. We love that Nintendo is willing to be so transparent with us. And I agree. I think this is a very smart move for Nintendo to be transparent, but it also kind of hints at maybe how they felt about this entire situation, because that means Metroid Prime 4 must have been a real disaster. It really must have been, if this is the type of approach that they have to take to rectifying the situation. And B, I wonder if they were really concerned, like super concerned about going dark for a long period of time with Prime 4. Like, if they thought that they were going to get a lot of backlash on not talking about it throughout 2019, because the expectation from a lot of people, myself included, was that we were going to get something in 2019. I didn't think we were going to get the actual game, but it would have been nuts if they went through this entire year and we didn't get like a subtitle, a teaser, some sort of gameplay, anything. And I don't know if they were like worried that was going to be some bit of bad press if they didn't bring it up, so they decided to kind of get ahead of the curve, or maybe there was that, again, this Game Informer story, maybe that was being worked on and they kind of wanted to get ahead of the press. No matter what it was, the choice to come out ahead and to talk about this in a very public way and be brutally honest and say, hey, look, we screwed up and we're going to start over, has been received almost universally as a positive step forward for Nintendo. And I think this is actually part of a larger picture for Nintendo. The Switch era in general has been very open for Nintendo. They've been opening up and talking more about their development processes and practices, more so than I ever remember them being. I think the people don't really think about this a lot, but do you notice how much content we're getting relating to, as an example, the development of Breath of the Wild? We are getting all these books highlighting, early art and prototype stages and stuff like that. They talked about it at GDC. They showed off literal prototypes of Breath of the Wild. There's been tons and tons of interviews, and this is just one example, but that type of stuff didn't happen before. And I think you're seeing that across the board, across the entire corporation, where we're getting more interviews from their presidents. We're seeing more of their dev teams open up and talk about how it went along, how they designed the games, what type of inspirations they took from the games. And I think this might be a new step forward for Nintendo, and I hope it is. And that's what they're doing for Metroid Prime 4 in this situation. What I will say about Metroid Prime 4 that really scares me about this, besides just kind of being slightly disappointed that we're not going to hear about this game, but again, that's not a big deal as long as it ends up coming out and being a great game, a great title, something that I really want to play, is I'm actually significantly worried that this delay will make Metroid Prime 4 a very costly expenditure for Nintendo, thus putting the Metroid franchise as a whole in a really bad spot. So let me get into that and why I think that is. So Metroid Prime in general is already a very expensive franchise for Nintendo. At least that's my assumption. Just considering that Metroid Prime more so than, let's say, a Yoshi or a Kirby, I mean, it uses high-end HD realistic graphics. They're open style 3D environments that like you don't really have to deal with in a Yoshi game or a Kirby game or most other Nintendo games or a lot of other Nintendo games. So if you're going to chart on a spectrum how expensive Metroid Prime is in general, I would already say that it's on the expensive side, right? But now you have a situation where they already have been in development for a couple of years, and you're going to expand that to even more, like 3 more years, something like that. So are we talking about a game that's going to have, when it's all said and done, a 4 to 5 to 6 year development cycle? Because that's going to mean Metroid Prime 4, when it actually releases, will be one of the most expensive titles that Nintendo ever produced, really. And why that's so concerning to me is Metroid is already on thin ice. It's always been on thin ice. Having multiple droughts throughout its history, like we get a lot of Metroid games and then we don't, and then we get a lot of Metroid games and then they take it away from us because it doesn't sell nearly as well as Zelda and Mario Kart, and they're hot franchises. Metroid has always kind of been the younger brother, living in the shadows, if you will. And these last few games for the Metroid franchise have not been, knocked out of the park really in terms of sales. You had Federation Force, which was the return after Metroid Other M, and I know people, not from a design standpoint, okay? Yes, Federation Force was kind of like a spin-off, but in Nintendo's eyes, maybe they can see that as a financial flop for Metroid. Even if you don't want to see it as a financial flop for Metroid, it was definitely a financial flop. And then after they announced Metroid Prime 4, you had Samus Returns for the 3DS, or was it Return of Samus? Might be Return of Samus. I hate that they're named so close to each other because then I just get them mixed up all the time. But that game, the last time I checked up on that game, it did not pass 1 million sales. That is not great. I mean, for how good that game is, it's not a revolutionary Metroid game, but it is good, and it deserves to do better than 1 million, and it did not surpass that. For the 3DS, a console that is nearing 90 million units, or if not already surpassed 90 million, I can't remember on the top of my head right now. Less than 1 million, not so great. So already you're kind of batting at a loss. You're starting from a hole. And if Metroid Prime 4 really is going to come out and be a very costly expenditure for Nintendo, it's going to be very expensive for them, and it doesn't recuperate that money and then some. If Metroid Prime 4 isn't a 5 million plus seller game, I wonder if that puts the Metroid franchise in a tough spot. And that's just not something I want to see, especially if Metroid Prime 4 comes out and it's not fantastic. If it's just okay, if it's just good, if it's like an 8 out of 10 or something like that. And all of the people that were kind of waiting on the edge to say, hey, should I get into Metroid Prime 4? And they're just like, oh, you know what? Maybe not. And then you have a game that's maybe like a 1 to 2 million seller, which is successful. I mean, you got to say that's a successful game, but I'm concerned that even so, for the amount of money they're going to have to put in to rebooting this process, and maybe they just will throw it away after that. I don't know. Maybe I'm being too pessimistic. You have to let me know what you think about that, because that was the first thing that jumped into my heart. It's like, oh no, like this is not good. Whenever Metroid gets expensive, then we don't see Metroid, and that's not what I want to see. So I hope that maybe I'm just being way too, concerned, way too pessimistic about this, and I shouldn't think about it that way. The bright side about all of this is that I'm sure that it sounds like Nintendo really cares. It sounds like they're giving it back to a studio that really cares. If they did, according to the Imran Khan's tweets, if Retro Studios really did make a pitch for them, then obviously they are also excited about this news. So when it's all said and done, when Metroid Prime 4 does release, I do expect to get a good game. The only question I have left about all this topic is Metroid Prime Trilogy. I mean, you have to imagine that if that game is done and they were planning on releasing that in December, the only thing I could think of that would put that on edge is that they were trying to reach some sort of milestone by the end of the year for Metroid Prime 4. And when the time hit, December hit around and they just didn't hit that milestone, that kind of set off the marketing for that game. And Metroid Prime Trilogy, I mean, it is a different game. It's not exactly the same, but you have to imagine that Metroid Prime Trilogy was being planned to be, part of that marketing scheme. It's part of it. They want to strategically release Prime Trilogy so that Prime 4 gets the biggest amount of hype or whatever it might be. I'm not sure exactly what would be the best way to do that, but I would guess that they had a plan for it, and this shakeup for Prime 4 set it out of whack, and now they don't exactly know what to do with Metroid Prime Trilogy, and they put it on hold. If I were Nintendo, I would kind of use Metroid Prime Trilogy as more of like an apology release of sorts. Like, I wouldn't hold off of from releasing Metroid Prime Trilogy or talking about it, the port for the Switch, up until we get closer to Metroid Prime 4, because that could take years. Even if that does lead to a better marketing campaign for Prime 4, I would say, okay, hold off from releasing it when they originally were. Find a new time period for it and say, hey, I know that you were expecting Prime 4. I'm sorry, we can't give you that. Instead, here's maybe like a Prime 4 title. Like, oh, okay, after 6 months of development on it, here's the subtitle for Metroid Prime 4, and to go one step further, Metroid Prime Trilogy port releases. Boom. There you go. That's kind of what I want to see about it. But this is a large, juicy topic, and there are so many things to get into. The transparency of it, how Nintendo communicated this. Should they have done that? Should they have kept it secret? I mean, so many developers you read about kind of go through a process like this where they have to start over, but they don't talk about it. They don't kind of have this one-on-one with their fans to discuss something like that. So do we like this? Is this something that we should encourage Nintendo and other game studios to do? How do you think this will affect Metroid Prime 4? How do you think this will affect Metroid as a franchise? There's just so much to unpack here that I want to hear from you guys about what you think. And so let me know again, heartcontainerspodcast@gmail.com about this topic, and we'll dive into it later. But until then, I'm going to move on to our next topic of the day, which involves Nintendo President Shuntaro Furukawa. So speaking of being transparent and open, like I said earlier in the show, Furukawa, I've seen so many interviews with him lately, and I don't know what it is. It must be, or I hope it is. This is like a turning point for Nintendo where they're just being a lot more open than before. And Furukawa is willing to take a lot of interviews with these Japanese publications, as he did in this next topic, in this next story, and just kind of reveal some insights about what's going on with the inner workings of Nintendo, because I love chewing on this stuff. I love thinking about where Nintendo could be going with this stuff. So again, Nintendo President Shuntaro Furukawa was asked once again about the company's ambitious plan to hit 20 million Switch hardware units before the end of the fiscal year in March. And his response, it stirred a fair bit of conversation. So I'm just going to read the quote directly so you get a sense of where I'm coming from. The quote is, this is what Furukawa had to say in response to that. He says, quote, "It is an extremely ambitious but worthwhile achievement, so we will maintain this goal. Nintendo Switch is our primary sales objective, and we are not considering a successor or price cut at this time." End quote. So the first half is, again, just saying, hey, yeah, we know that this is ambitious, but it's still a worthwhile goal to have, and it's still a goal that we're going to keep in mind. And following that, or as to go along with that, we're not considering a successor or price cut at this time. And at this time, people can read it, or you can read it as 2019, I would imagine, not in the near future. So again, the part that's gotten taken out, not of context, but that's been really chewed on a lot, is that second half. We're not considering a successor or price cut at this time. And what does that mean for the Switch? So if you ask me, a successor means anything that's more powerful than the Switch. Well, actually, I don't know. That's a good question. You wouldn't call the new 3DS a successor to the 3DS, would you? I wouldn't. I feel like that's still part of the 3DS family of systems. So really, when he talks about a successor here, I don't think that's really too much of a significant tell from Furukawa, because that could mean anything. I don't believe a more powerful Switch that just has slightly more power in the same vein as like the PS4 Pro or the Xbox One X would count as a successor. If you do, I mean, let's say we do consider that, then it's still, I guess that confirms that we're not going to get like a Switch Pro or something in 2019 or anytime soon, but still, it doesn't mean anything. Who knows what Furukawa means by successor? I think the more interesting part of this quote is a price cut at this time, because it's been my opinion for a long time, and it continues to be my opinion that that Nintendo is going to have a solution for younger gamers in 2019. And what I mean by that is there has to be an entryway into the Switch ecosystem for people that can't necessarily afford to pay for a Switch, and also who are young and don't necessarily need to get in to the high-end gaming market. For the past few years, the 3DS has taken over that role. The 3DS has been the cheap system that you can get younger gamers or people who can't afford a Switch into the Nintendo ecosystem. But the 3DS is on its way out. The 3DS really is it's retiring. It's on its deathbed. It's been alive for what, 8 years almost? Or something around that time period, and sales are dipping. They are actually dipping. 2018 compared to the last 2 years, 2017 and 2016, has been a slow year for the 3DS, more so than usual. People aren't buying the 3DS in mass the way that they usually do, and it's time, in my opinion, for Nintendo to start replacing that role that the 3DS was filling as the entryway console, as the console that you can get into for a very low cost of entry with the Switch in some sort. So to do that, the main barrier as an entryway console to get into any video game system, video game ecosystem, is price. So for Furukawa to say something like there's not going to be a price cut at this time is really intriguing to me. And I think what that means is that we're more likely to see a new video game piece of hardware, like a Switch Lite of some sort, a Switch with less features than the actual Switch that costs less than a Switch price cut in 2019. And to add on to that, there was another report that seemed to happen later on in the day that I want to bring up right now as a good kind of turning point for this discussion and where that might go. Digitimes, a publication in Taiwan, like kind of like a newspaper as far as I know, has received word from multiple component suppliers that they expect shipments of the Nintendo Switch to reduce by 25 to 30% in 2019. So take that where you will. Digitimes is also, they released a report at some time last year saying that they expect Nintendo to reveal a less expensive Switch model in 2019. So I think you can read into that. This is where I'm going with the conversation, guys. I think that Furukawa saying, don't expect a successor, don't expect a price cut. Digitimes saying that Nintendo Switch production is going to be reduced by, around 30%, 25%, and that they also believe that there's going to be a less expensive Switch model in 2019. That more so than ever, all of the leaks, all of the rumors, all the conversations surrounding 2019 being the next step in the Switch's lifetime, the next evolution for Nintendo in the Switch, is leading to a point where we're just going to see a piece of hardware for the Switch that is going to replace the 3DS and be that cheaper entryway model. And it's just going to have something about it that makes it cheaper, whether that's just no dock, whether that is like I've heard that they might just have a Switch that doesn't have detachable Joy-Con. So then at that point, do you even call it a Switch? Is it just a piece of hardware like a Game Boy Plus, like whatever you want to call it, but it runs the same operating system as the Switch? So then you kind of have two pillars. I mean, it's crazy. We don't really know where Nintendo's going to go from here, because ever since they kind of merge this portable and home console concept together, it's anything is fair game. Nintendo has traditionally, for a long time, since the Game Boy era, been a two-pillar company where they have the handheld pillar and the home console pillar. And we're at a point in time where you could argue that they never need a two-prong approach ever again. That they could just have the one prong. They could just have the Switch and it could fill both of those needs. And that's a good point, because if they do if they maintain this one prong approach, then they don't split the resources. Which is, I think, part of the reason why the Switch is doing so well, is that it's able to have so much first-party support due to the fact that they're not splitting the resources against two different pillars, two different consoles, like they were in last generation, where they had to support the 3DS and the Wii U. And that means doing things like having a Mario Kart specifically for the 3DS and having a Mario Kart specifically for the Wii U. But now for the Switch, you can just do one. And that's what makes it so appealing. And that's part of the reason why it's so successful. But does that mean that they have to stay in this area? Not necessarily. They could have a two-prong approach where they have the Switch and then another console where it still plays the same games at the Switch, but it serves a different audience. Releasing a new console in 2019 that is like $150 is something that's entryway style, something that's a lot cheaper than the Switch, that plays all the Switch games, but has a lot less features. So let's just say it has no dock, because that's probably a given. Let's say that it has Joy-Cons attached to it, so you don't detach the Joy-Cons. Whatever they have to do to get it cheaper does make a lot of sense if they want to take over for the 3DS market. I can totally see that happening. Another reason why I can see that happening is this is the year of Pokemon. And Pokemon is always a big tell for Nintendo. They always reveal their cards for Pokemon because that is a humongous franchise for them that makes a lot of money for the company. And if you go back in time, let's hop into the time machine, guys. Let's go to the 3DS era. You have the 3DS. They're about to release Pokemon Sun and Moon. What do? On the same exact day Pokemon Sun and Moon releases, the 2DS is released. The same day in the US. I can't speak for other regions. I don't remember other regions. I remember in the US, the 2DS released on the same exact day as Pokemon Sun and Moon. Why? Because Pokemon appeals to a wide demographic. There are so many people that love Pokemon, and Nintendo knows that. Nintendo knows that people are invested in Pokemon, and when Pokemon comes to a console, it sells consoles. So they need to make sure that they're appealing to everyone who can and wants to buy Pokemon. Otherwise, they're leaving money on the table. And there's a ton of younger kids, and there's also a ton of people who just don't have the money flat out to pay for a Switch that will be, no doubt, excited for the next generation of Pokemon. And that's where this Switch Lite, this other piece of hardware that's going to be cheaper, can come into play. And that's why I feel like we're seeing things from Furukawa saying, hey, don't expect a successor from the Switch, don't expect a price cut, because for all intents and purposes, if they do have this cheaper system, this cheaper Switch that has less features, it's not a Switch. Or at least they can't call it a Switch. I mean, it's in the name, guys. I know that they've had naming weirdness in the past, like the 3DS and the 2DS, and it's like, okay, I get it. Like this 2DS plays 3DS games, but not in 3D. Like they've had confusing nomenclature in the past, and they can totally continue that confusing nomenclature. But the point is, it really isn't going to be the Switch in essence, in technicality. I think that's the future that we're going in. Again, I want to hear what you guys think. What do you think about this topic? Are you disappointed that we're not getting a successor? Do you think that when Furukawa says successor, he means like an actual successor, like I was thinking about, like a Switch 2 or maybe a Switch Pro? There's a new Switch XL or something count as a successor? And also, what is your opinion on this Switch Lite nonsense, on this cheaper entryway console that I'm so confident, I'm so sure we're going to get in 2019? Do you agree? Do you disagree? You gotta let me know. But that's it, guys. That's episode 1. Those were all the topics I had planned to get into for the show. And remember that if you want to leave me any feedback, suggestions, opinions on anything that was discussed, or even leave a topic that could be discussed in a future episode, you can reach me at heartcontainerspodcast@gmail.com or at RomeFawaz on Twitter. This has been Heart Containers episode number 1 for Monday, January 28th. And thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you real soon.